Your next vehicle from Community Motors of Mason City.
Great service from 3 locations: Community on Monroe, Community Motors Westside, and Mason City Ford. 10 new franchises and hundreds of vehicles to give you more choices. Plus, Community offers an exclusive 3-3 warranty on pre-owned vehicles and 10-year, 250,000-mile warranty on new. Need more reasons why? Stop or visit CommunityAutoGroup.com.
Because nobody beats a community deal.
Let the record reflect that all members are present currently, with the exception of Mr. Hickey. Do we have a motion and a second to adopt the agenda? Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. Well, we're going to move to number 1, which is 28 agreement with Landfill North Iowa. Here you have documentation in your pockets, and Mr. Tornquist is the Mason City representative to the landfill of North Iowa, and we'll let him offer any thoughts on what we have here, and then we'll have a discussion and hopefully provide him at least with some guidance as to what I want to say.
Perfect. First, I want to thank Mr. Locher. He's the LNI board attorney, and Bill Rowland, the director of the landfill, for coming. They're here today in case we have questions that I can answer and to offer perspective and depth to the conversation that I might not be able to offer. And Barney, right? Oh, I'm sorry, Dave? Okay. Thank you guys for being here. Basically, the 2080 agreement that we've had, that we're party to with the landfill in North Iowa, is the same 2080 agreement that was made possible by the legislature in 1965. And the primary reason that the LNI board wants to rework the 2080 agreement is because of the withdrawal clause, which, because of post-closure funding requirements, the current 2080 agreement makes that problematic if any community withdrew, particularly a community of any size. And so the primary thing that we need to focus on is actually the third thing in the memo, the withdrawal requirement. And the post-closure, the requirement to set aside post-closure funds was not required by the legislature until 1988. And so that's why it's not addressed by the current 2080 agreement. That agreement was in place for 18 years before the post-closure fund requirement came into play. And so actually it's been a liability since 1988, and we seek to fix it now. The other 2 issues on there, as far as voting and board member eligibility, I would consider to be ancillary. However, at the November, we discussed the document that you have in front of you at our last board meeting and at our next board meeting, which is scheduled for November, thus the need to try to squeeze in a work session prior to the November LNI board meeting. We're going to try to whittle this down and find consensus, and my guesstimate would be that in January, the committee that's working on this may have something in front of the board to vote on. At the point in time a revised 2080 agreement is voted on by the membership, it then goes back to each member community for the elected body to act on. So I thought it was important for us to have a work session for 2 reasons. One is I want to make sure that when I represent Mason City at the LNI board, I have a sense that I'm representing the majority opinion of the elected body of Mason City, which is us. And secondly, it's going to come to us anyway, so it would be nice if we get a pretty good feel for where we are before the committee goes through all the work of really getting things down in black and white and bringing it before the larger body to be voted on. I don't really care to offer my thoughts on any of the 3 areas until we've had discussion, because I really don't want to influence the discussion. I do have opinions in each of the 3 areas, but I'm more interested in your opinions at this point. With that as the background, Jim or Bill, is there anything that you want to add to the conversation before we start taking some of these things around?
Folks, do you have any thoughts? Ms. Olberg.
Well, how would the voting affect some of the smaller towns in raising it from 3,000 to 5,000?
Every community has a minimum of 1 vote.
Okay.
So if you're a community of less than 3,000, you would be unaffected.
Do you know how many fall in that?
Most. most. I do have the roster.
I guess what my question is that the difference between the 3,000 and 5,000, how many are the 3,000 and under, and then how many would it add going from 5,000 and under?
$20 communities are under 3,000. Seven are over.
How many fall in that small window though, I guess is what I'm asking?
Between 3 and 5.
Yes. So how many under 3,000 and then how many under 5,000? I guess is the number I'm looking for, so it'd be 20 then.
Okay, let's do one question at a time.
Well,
I'm there between
you said
three.
20 fall under
I'm there between-
3,000, so how many fall under
Yeah.
5,000?
Between 3 and 5.
Between 3 and 5. I'm sorry. Okay, how many fall under 5,000 then, including that 20? I'm just looking for how many communities this would affect.
How many are under 5,000?
Yes.
27 and 29. Clear Lake and Mason City are the only two that are over. Actually, Saragota County.
In Saragota County.
Yeah. Saragota County, Clear Lake, and Mason City are the only member entities that are over 5,000.
So 7 entities are in that 3 to 5,000. If we assume 20 or 33.
Take your word for it.
Sure, I'll do that.
Anything else for me?
No, go ahead.
John?
And I'm glad I looked for that, I couldn't find it, I know we had it the last time we talked about this in August or something. I'm just looking at percentages, and like I said, I don't really have much of an opinion on which one right now, the 3 or 7. I guess part of me, I'm interested or intrigued by the number 4 with having 2 votes. Say 5, meaning that if the members, we said municipality had 6 votes, they would have 2 board members from the municipality. I guess anytime you can split a big chunk, to me, it's a good thing. So more people have to, one person doesn't hold all the cards, so to speak. And I mean, I would have to do the math, meaning percentage-wise, and how it goes from 1,500 now, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And then 3,000 is 5,000. See, I didn't have those numbers, and that needs to be, I have to wrap my mind around the numbers a little bit more. But I'd like to see what more people think, but because out of the 4 intrigues me, and like I said, if we had over, would we have over 6? Because we're under 30,000 now, though. So we would not, and so that's almost an irrelevant vote, and we are the largest one, right? So
Well, we have 19 votes, so
We
we
have a
would.
lot.
no, I'm saying if we went to, this is if everything else stays the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
So with 19 votes, we
We
would,
had 9 and
we'd
8, right?
have 3, but that's not necessarily the final split either.
Okay.
I mean, it's,
If we went to 3,000, could they do 1 and 4 together? Probably not.
sure,
You could.
yeah.
I mean, you minimize votes, but at the same time, you split the power. Now, if there's 2 people came from this table, a lot of times, agreement or not, but the fact is, I'm just a fan of spreading power or influence as much as you can, when you can do it. And so like I said, that number 4 is intriguing to me. Go ahead.
Ms. Brias?
But I'm just thinking, on the other hand, though, Mason City and Clear Lake represent a large amount of the inflow of, number 1, the refuge, but also the money that's going into them. So, I mean, realistically, you kind of want to think about the amount of our influence, if you will, if we pulled or walked away or whatever. I'm not so sure I would take away all of the the additional votes for Clear Lake and Mason City. I'm not sure that just evening the playing field per se would be the way to do it.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is that, to me, it's not even about the influence as much as it is assets and liabilities, therefore shares. Because we have put money in and we have a liability there also. We all have a liability, if any community does have a liability. If you go to increase population from 3 to 5, that is a consolidation, right? If, you know, as opposed to, I would rather have a stock split, because that's what this is not a share. And we're not gonna split it, I know that, but why would this entity, or any entity that has assets or liabilities, increase the money of the shareholder? That doesn't make a lot of sense.
I guess maybe I wasn't understood what I'm saying. In the 15, 3,000, or 5,000, whatever it is, to me, yeah, that's not what I was discussing. I'm saying if right now we had Scott on the board and he has 19 votes, right? Let's say he's issued at the board and all of a sudden, you go berserk one day and says he's not gonna listen to us, he's gonna make the call as he sees fit. If we split representation amongst 19 votes, we would have 3
To
people.
add another member.
From our
So
town,
we don't
representing
share.
more of our, yeah, that's what I was talking, I'm not talking about taking power or influence or shares, I'm saying is I would prefer to see 2 or 3 people represent Mason City than one person holding all the cards representing us, not necessarily the other LNI members, I was looking at our representation there. And I said, if one person with such power, I'd rather see it split amongst 2 or 3 different members if it stays at this representation. That's what I was talking about the number for, that makes more sense.
The other nice thing about that, it's not just power, but it goes back to the quorum for the board as well. And the quorum is based on number of votes. And for example, if Mason City, Clear Lake, and Sarasota County don't show up for a meeting, it's very hard to have a quorum. Whereas if Mason City was divided up into 2 or 3 or 4 people, one person can miss. And it doesn't impact the quorum as negatively.
The quorum is based on votes more than people.
Yeah. But you still have to have half, if I remember the bylaws correctly, you still have to have half the membership there.
Yeah, Jim's not
Is that
understood,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, so it's not just Mason
So there's
City,
2
Clear Lake shows up.
That's right, you need both, you
Right.
need half the members plus half the votes.
Okay.
But it's still, by what John's suggesting, would make it easier, because Clear Lake would, or the county potentially would have another representative, would make it easier.
The one thing I would say though is if they were gonna look at doing it where you would divide it up amongst 3 or 4 people from Mason City, when you divide up the votes, you probably have to change the part regarding it only being elected officials too, along the way. That part's probably gonna have to change, because for us, that would be hard with the, everybody's schedule. And also if it was 4, then we have a quorum for the president, so we wouldn't be able to do that even though it wasn't for our meeting, so it'd be best not to have that.
Well, and quite honestly, and the next thing on here is eligibility, which goes towards, do you have to be elected or not? And to me, that's a non-issue if we protect our vote, if our vote's not diluted. That is to say, if our vote's not diluted, I don't have an issue with community deciding in their own representation whether the people are elected or not.
Right.
But if the people in Mason City have their vote diluted, then there's a little more skin in the game.
Sure.
How do you foresee, Scott, and perhaps I think you're doing this exactly the right way now, where you're coming to your body and saying, and it's laid out that you have to be elected officials, that's representation, fine. But you're coming and getting feedback from it. If they're not an elected official, how do you see them, coming back to this body and asking how we want to be represented at the board?
I don't know, we'd have to figure that
That'd be an
out.
interesting question.
Yeah, because, that's a balance. if we think about what's happened in the last year, this
Yeah.
body can't tell anybody how to vote, whether they're a council person or not. I mean, that's the way the system's supposed to work. And that's not any different than when we appoint people to planning and zoning or any other board or commission. So I think it goes to making appointments, not so much on people that we think are gonna vote a certain way, but people that we know are going to evaluate the situation
Fair.
and vote based on information, yeah. I guess, some background I would share, and this kind of goes where you were going with this, Gene. Right now, as it stands right now, by way of example, Popejoy is a community of 79 people, and they have one vote. Mason City's, based on the 2010 census, we're a little over 29,000 people, and we have 19 votes. So Popejoy has one vote for 79, and basically if we divide our 19 over the population, we have one vote per 1,477 people right now, which means an individual citizen in Popejoy basically has a little over 18 times as much representation on a prorated basis as a citizen in Mason City. And I think we need to remember, it's not about having equal representation as board members at the LNI board. It's about making sure that we have equal representation for citizens of the communities that are paying for the service. So for that reason, I'm not excited at all about increasing the population figure to 3,000 or 5,000 because it further dilutes the representation of the citizen in Mason City. And it's Mason City that's by far and away paying the lion's share of the freight. But because of the issues that have been put on the table, I think it's a great idea to break that vote up amongst more people.
You mean the Mason City vote?
Well, it'd be
Across the
clearly
board.
in the county.
Yeah, across the board.
Yeah.
I mean, the committee would have to decide how many votes a person could have, and based on that number, and that's a moving target. Right now, I think the example's what, 5?
Was the example.
And that's a moving target. This is all stake in the ground for discussion, but once that number becomes a firm number, then we know how many people we have to have. And then we can drop back and figure out how many people we want to be on the council versus appointments at large. I think there's some benefit to having some at-large appointments.
Well, and it does allow, in the current LNI 2080 agreement, they have to be we have to have an elected representative that is currently there, but you can designate a substitute. But it appears to me as if you have to have an elected official initially, and I see Jim nodding his head.
Does that cause a problem for quorums in some of the smaller communities, getting an elected official in attendance every meeting?
Hey, you guys can answer this better than I can. How many of the members that we have on the board, how many of them are elected in their communities versus appointed non-elected people? It's almost 3 to 1. Non-elected. Yeah, and we've got good people serving that are non-elected. The chair of our board right now is not elected in his community, correct?
Correct.
And to me, that's really a non-issue. It's basically in there to protect, that's in there right now to protect the value of our vote, the value of the citizens that we represent.
Scott, I want clarification. I was just looking at this with the idea that there's 6 votes. Would that mean, and only one person having 5, does that mean that one of the board members would have 3 or 4 that their vote is worth? That's I thought so, but I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, and especially for Mason City, I mean, if the limit was 4 or 5 votes per person, I don't know if it makes a lot of sense to have 4 people from Mason City on the board. I guess the committee will have to figure that out, but it may want to be X number of votes per person with a limit on the number of people that a given community has, which means by default, there may be 1 or 2 people with more than that lower limit. And I think it would be up to the community to decide which people had X number of votes, or we could even maybe, I don't know, if we can make them fractions. I don't know.
I mean, I don't know why you couldn't make them fractions, but you could even just, entertain a clause that says if you're over X amount, whatever, then you're splitting your vote. And whatever the fraction turns out, it turns out. Or you could do it 2 or 3 times. I would probably caution against getting 4, and that's my own prejudice, because I gotta find the person. There's a lot of folks to find.
Well, and it does have a cost implication as well, at least to the landfill, although technically it's pretty minute in the big scheme of things, because the board position is paid. It's a paid per meeting and then also mileage. Jim, or any of you 3 guys, is there anything on these first 2 items that we haven't talked about that we should?
I would just comment that the voting issue came up several years ago in the context of a situation where we couldn't get a quorum. And the concern expressed at that time was that if one of the communities or several of the communities having the higher level of votes didn't show up, you could have a majority of the outlying communities, the Lovejoys, come, and we couldn't have a meeting. So the committee alternative of splitting votes really addresses that quorum issue, which is the genesis of the whole effort here.
Is there, does that solve the lion's share of the perceived issue? Is there any need, from y'all's perspective, to go to the 3,000 population per vote or 5,000 per vote?
I can't speak for either the committee or the board, but I think it would be fair to say that there are some members on this 29-member board who would prefer that the field was absolutely level in terms of each representative having 1 vote. How many of those people and how strong their views are, can't say, but it's out there. There is some unpleasantness, I guess I would characterize it as, with respect to the current system. I'm not sure how widely spread that's about. As a matter of fact, the committee's conclusion is that there's good reason for have weighted voting. You see that in the
Right.
report.
Well, and I think I've spoken to that. I reiterate, it's our job to make sure that the people in Mason City, the ones that are paying the bills, have equal representation versus equal representation at the board member level. It's the same way our federal government works. New York has more representatives than the state of Iowa does because of population.
But they have 2 senators in Rhode Island, has 2 senators. I mean, this goes back to the constitutional debate.
And that's where we break up, that's where we break up the vote amongst members.
We need to Connecticut compromise what brought our Congress about.
If I could
Go ahead.
comment on just that point. One of the proposals in here having to do with what it would take to pass a measure is that not only would you have a majority of the weighted votes, but you would also have a majority of members. And there's a real rough analogy to just precisely what Councilman Lee has referred to, and that is our Congress works. You have one house that is based on population in terms of representation. You have another house that is strictly based on the member or the state,
Mhm.
and population is not a factor. And that is another thing that we haven't discussed yet, but I think we probably will before you're done.
I think that's a fair
Well-
point, but the differentiation is that this in the end is a business, it's a 2080 agreement with assets, liabilities, therefore shares and representation. It seems to me as if those shares and that liability and assets have to be represented.
Well, and that's a good point. I guarantee you, the smaller communities that would like to have a 1-for-1 vote would not want to share in the equal distribution of the cost if we had a closure issue at the landfill. They would expect it to be prorated based on population. Guarantee you. Popejoy couldn't afford what Mason City could
That's
afford.
exactly right.
But those costs are set aside already,
Yeah,
that everyone has contributed to.
just giving a financial example.
Sure.
But by the same token, if a community withdrew a Popejoy, we wouldn't expect them to get the same payout for withdrawal that Mason City would.
Right, but I don't think that goes with the voting part of this, that's the other issue that we talked about down here. For withdrawing that
Um,
decision.
What other issues are coming up, maybe this isn't really done for, but where the weighted vote or prorated assets upon withdrawal, I mean, what's coming up that, to give us an example, not being there firsthand, that the weighted vote is, that a smaller community would rather have it be 1-to-1 where that would make more sense? I guess I'm seeing the biggest issues.
The issue with CES.
John?
I didn't know if there's any other examples from meeting to meeting
I was
basis.
gonna say, has there been an issue
No, no.
within the 20 years prior to this, or has there been any other weighted issue other than the CES debate?
There was one, vice chair or chairman, well, who was affected by it a year or two ago. That was it.
There was also a budget vote,
Yeah, the budget vote, that's right.
and some years ago, there were a couple of instances where votes on bidding with respect to a project out there gave rise to an issue. And what I mean by that is you had a situation where the minority ruled, basically, because of the weighted vote.
Let me ask you a question, Jim. I like the scenario of having to have at least 50% of the members present, as well as 50% of the weighted vote. But what if, and let's use the CES project by way of example because it's an easy one. What if a minority number of the members were prepared to move the project forward and the smaller communities chose not to show up for the meeting, which is in effect a sit-down strike? How would we manage that?
Because of the quorum issue.
Mm-hmm.
Hadn't really thought about it. Theoretically, I could see that as being a problem because the quorum requirement does have the two components to it.
And that's very much my contention between the difference between government, because government provides for provision for business.
Well, I liked where the committee was going. Do you think there's a creative way we could build the 2080 agreement to protect against that eventuality? Perhaps if there's not a quorum, the meeting's postponed to a date and time within a week, and then the second time the meeting's called, the membership quorum doesn't apply. Would that be a suitable safeguard?
2 hours there.
It's interesting. It's compromise. John?
The other compromise would be to get a vote for a city, who vote for representation. Popejoy goes to 2, we go up to 20. It's not 1-to-1. Somewhat of a compromise at the little town, saying you get a vote for citizen representation, you get a vote for your name being a town or a city. So Popejoy would go to 2, a bunch of others go to 2 or 3. We'd only go up 1. It's kind of the compromise between the senatorial representation, but again, this is a 2080 agreement, it's a business, we gotta watch what's best for Mason City, but also understand we hold a lot of cards, and if I was Little Town too, I think I'd be a little nervous of big bad Mason City doing, or Saragordo going into cahoots. But, no, I am for the 4th, putting more members to represent Mason City or Saragordo or Clear Lake, if the formula does allow it. I guess my initial instinct is I don't want to see that 1,500 population change. But as somewhat of a compromise, I would say I'd be okay with adding a vote just for your town and keeping it at 1,500, putting representation, be it 5, 4, whatever it is, so we have more members there, so if Scott needs to be gone or whoever's gonna be gone, 19 votes, the other 3 people or 2 people should be able to represent just fine, show up, and if we don't, obviously, we have an obvious conspiracy theory going. And so to me, that's where, at least from my understanding, that's what I see.
I just have one question, check for understanding,
Yeah.
on the Pope Joy example.
Yeah.
It's not like we're picking on Pope Joy,
No, but
they're
they're
just
just
happen to be
the
the
smallest
smallest
community.
community.
And it's
What was it?
Are you suggesting that
Well-
every community would have a minimum of 2 votes?
Correct.
The only thing I just did, the math you said before, 20 cities under 3,000, now all of a sudden all the small towns now have votes to overturn anything big like
Yeah.
They just trumped this. If you give every one of those small towns below 3,000 an additional vote, we've now just given them all more votes than what we would have, and our ability to impact.
Our alone, or Whistler, or and with Curly.
Well, I'm just looking at, you would add the others too, but I mean, it's basically adding 20 votes to the table on the other side for the small communities. It really heavily weights it. So, I mean, I understand where you're going, but I think it would not be the right way to go. I think it would go too far.
Hey, Bill, do you know off the top of your head of the total revenue stream in the landfill? Do you know how much of it comes from Mason City?
Percentage.
You have to define that better. Do you mean people that live in Mason City that bring waste to us? Or are you talking,
Yeah, tipping fees, waste that's
there's
coming
no
from
way
Mason
that we
City?
can keep track of who's coming, what waste is coming from what community, no. We don't know that directly. That's what that's
Okay,
part of-
that's fair. How about tipping fees coming from the Mason City Sanitation Department?
Obviously, it's going to be proportionate to what the populations are.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, population, not the vote, but population.
So it's in the 45 to 50% range of revenues?
Again, I can't put my finger on an answer, because if I'm a waste hauler and I'm hauling waste from a different community, but I'm from this community, who does that belong to? I mean, the community member in Mason City is paying for it, but it's waste from somewhere else. That's what we're looking at. So
I'm
it's
sorry,
not-
wait,
it's-
I should have asked, I didn't think of it, or I would have asked it before, I'm sorry.
It's not as cut and dry as
Yeah.
Mason City will bring this much waste to us versus Popejoy.
Okay.
The comparison we have, if you wanna go financially, is the $1.35 per capita, is the easiest way to see the difference dollar-wise.
Okay. Thanks,
Does that make sense?
yes. Well, to try to move this along, if when the board discusses this next month, I took the position that we prefer not to see the vote diluted. We'd like to stay at 1,500 per vote. But we see merit to breaking that vote up amongst members, multiple members in the committee, and everybody else can figure out the numbers and percentages. And along that line of thought, we don't care who a particular community sends to the board to serve. That's for the community to decide. Is that representative of where we think we are at this point? Okay, so where the rubber really hits the road is on the withdrawing clause, and I agree strongly that this needs to be changed. If for no other reason than it's the right thing to do. We've got a post-closure fund right now of a little over $5 million, Bill.
Correct.
And the way the 2080 agreement is written right now is if, for the sake of discussion, Mason City withdrew, we would get a prorated share of all assets of the landfill, which right now includes the post-closure funds. And when you think about our size relative to the whole, that would take a significant dent in the post-closure funds that the landfill has. which would put the landfill at risk, especially when they get to that point in time. It's basically a hole that would have to be filled back in because the amount is determined by the state. And I don't feel that post-closure funds should be in the formula because post-closure funds are there to cover a liability that's been built. It's a liability that exists. And we had a larger share of creating that liability because of our population than any other member community. And for that reason, I don't think any community should have a claim on the post-closure funds. And that's, I think, what is spelled out in here. I think the question becomes, and I think it's a foregone conclusion, would you agree, guys, that we're gonna take post-closure funds out of the asset calculation for withdrawal?
We're required by state to have that number in there. So, say for instance, it counts toward the assets, but I don't feel that the landfill could just pull it out of there other than to close the landfill. So it would have to come from other.
Yeah. So pick a number for sake of discussion. Say $20 million in assets right now with land, equipment, cash on hand, which includes post-closure funds. Right now, any community that withdrew would get a prorated portion of $20 million, and basically it's payable immediately, which is another issue. And what we're talking about doing here is taking the post-closure funds out, in this case $5 million, so you'd have a readjusted base of $15 million, which would be available for prorated share. And so we're talking, that's the first thing, then we're talking about length of payout. And we're also talking about, should it be a straight calculation or should there be a percentage? Again, I have thoughts on that, but I don't necessarily want to guide the conversation until other people have shared their thoughts.
Just to clarify this, so you're asking to, if there is a withdrawing member, to go up to 10 years, but you wouldn't allow them to withdraw for perhaps 2 to 3 years? Is that what I'm reading?
What's in here is a whole bunch of ways this could be done. It's kind of like a buffet.
So it's either or this, no, or not?
Or
Any, all, none,
Combination.
got a different idea.
This was a committee of 5 people who volunteered off of the 29 board members to discuss this matter with myself and Jim present. And we, these were the things after a couple of meetings were the topics that we kept coming back to and the possible solutions. These are merely ideas that are out there for discussion. There wasn't a recommendation made. This was just what the committee has generated to this point.
So right now, you're telling me that if a community wanted to withdraw, it was like immediately and they were eligible to get their reimbursement stipend immediately? Is that what you're telling me?
Within 6 months,
Oh, within 6 months, okay.
which is pretty immediate.
That's
pretty
immediate.
$3 million.
That's immediate.
And it also includes that fund, that $5 million fund, which
It's
what
the
you're really
value
wanting.
of that,
Right,
yes.
but what you're wanting to do is maybe separate that out from the total calculation that they would be, that you would
By all
use.
means, yes. That's the conversation behind that is, that's there by law, but for good reason. That protects you guys as a community belonging to us as well.
If the landfill would happen to close.
If for some reason we
Right.
close, that's what
That
that
would be
money
good.
is there for.
Let's maintain.
To close it and to maintain it for 30 years or whenever the DNRC's fit.
And the reason a discussion about putting a percentage on top of the current value of the prorated fund is because of the risk of liabilities that are yet undetermined at the point that a community might withdraw. For example, if a community withdrew next year, and they took the terms of the buyout agreement, whatever they may be, and we close the landfill 20 or 30 years from now because we're out of capacity or for whatever reason, and discover at that time that we have an issue that was prior to that undetermined, it's the remaining member communities that are covering that liability that may be a liability that was created 30 or 40 years prior. So one way of assessing some risk for, or assess prorating for unknown risk for the future would be to add a contingency on top of the current value of the post-closure fund.
I think that's completely fair.
Yeah.
I think it's our responsibility, period. And if we're gonna put waste in the ground, it needs to be maintained, we should fulfill our commitments.
I think as a community, we have two moral obligations. One would be to cover the risk that we know we've already created. And the second would be to not cripple the landfill for any other community. You know, the odds of Mason City ever withdrawing from the landfill are, yeah,
Zero.
exactly. But it behooves us, as we're going through the process of putting together a 2080 agreement, to be as responsible as we can, because none of us can see into the future. And just because Mason City may not withdraw, doesn't mean
Someone
that
else, yeah.
one of the smaller outlying communities that may be closer to an alternative landfill might withdraw. So it comes into play.
Anybody else?
Have you had any communities withdraw, say within the last 10 years? And have you ever had to deal with it?
Not 10 years, we did have a community withdraw.
I think it was in the early 90s, Lake Mills withdrew.
Are you guys ready for a recommendation?
Yeah.
Well, without question, the post-closure funds need to be withdrawn from the asset calculation when you're calculating a withdrawal. I would put a contingency on the current value at the time of withdrawal of somewhere around 10 to 25%. And I would spread the payment over 10 years. That would be the least crippling to the landfill for remaining members. It's all about cash flow.
But you're still recommending to allow them to withdraw immediately instead of waiting like 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm interested in your perspective on that, Bill. If somebody wanted to withdraw, I don't know why we would make them wait 2 to 3 years.
As we were doing our research for this project, we talked to other landfills and took ideas from their 2080 agreements. And some of them had in their 1 to 2 year. Are you sure you want to do this clause, for lack of a better term? So we just discussed this at the meeting based on more information available, and that was what was discussed, was to
How do you feel about that? Do you think it's something that's needed, or?
I can see positives and I can see negatives, both sides of that.
The one thing that I was gonna say, the issue you're gonna have is that if a community's deciding to leave one landfill, the landfill they're going to is gonna have a buy-in requirement. So they're gonna need whatever resources they're gonna take, that they're gonna get for leaving this landfill to buy into the other one. So we're gonna want that money coming, if it was us that was doing it, I'd want that money coming back to us as quickly as possible. But already carrying it out over 10 years, they're gonna have to borrow money, more than likely, to get into that landfill to their buying cost, and then they'll make those payments.
I may have misunderstood what Scott asked, because I thought you were talking about how long, if the community said today, we want out.
No, I was carrying it a step further.
He's
Okay.
going, yeah, he's just going a
Yeah.
step further on it. I follow exactly.
So there would be a need, as a community leaving,
The
to have
community
some of those
will have a
funds.
cash flow problem,
Right.
essentially.
So would you want to cripple them for 10 years instead of just maybe 4 or 5?
Well, I think the
I mean,
issue
because that
is,
could really be detrimental to some communities
Right.
if you extend it out for 10 years.
a lot of it would have to do with how well the landfill can cover that kind of a payment back. It might need to be graduated, it might need to be by community and amount. It might be that it's 5 years for anything less than 1 million payout or 500,000 payout, and then for the higher dollar figures, it would be more extended and the cash flow.
You know, and I don't know that we need to, drive the ship. I think if we agree in principle that the buyout should occur over a period of time, I think the committee can work through all the details. I don't know that I have a strong opinion on whether we could let somebody go right away or within 2 to 3 years. I think that too warrants a broader board discussion, because I'm not sure that I'm clearly understanding what perspectives other people might have.
Well, and to be selfish as a landfill, and you want to keep as many people as you can because you're spreading the cost. If you create a system that they're not going to get all their money up front, that makes it harder for them to make that decision to jump ship. So, I wouldn't necessarily want to make it too easy on them to jump ship. They're going to get all their money right away, but looking at it, it's payout over time is probably the best, because it'll make it harder for them to decide to go.
Go ahead, Bill.
I was just gonna say, that one of the thoughts behind the 3 years now specifically was that the landfill that we looked at has been going a 3-year budget process where we go annually. So they've already calculated that 3-year period, so they wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to interrupt that budget they already had. That was the part about withholding them from leaving for a certain amount of time. When we get to the payout, yes, I can definitely attest to the fact that 10 years would be a much better payout for the landfill than 6 months. And it could be able to keep everybody else that's still staying.
You probably have to raise per capita rates on us and potentially, or tipping fees to make up for that payout.
One or the other or both.
Well, and that could turn into a house of cards. We could start having smaller communities drop them because of the increase in tip fees to cover the leading number, so. Which is gonna come right back to Mason City taxpayers.
Is this a
That
viable
should be-
option for other communities? I'm looking at this secondhand and trying to get some recommendations here. Is that something that's a concern?
What was the question?
Other communities, is this a viable option for them to, are we looking to change this so we can protect the communities that are there, that would be remaining if someone left?
Definitely, yeah. It could be a town the size of 30,000 or a town the size of 64. And it's gonna have different impact regardless, based on their population, obviously.
I think in general, from what I'm hearing you say though, is that you can go in principle, when you visit with the board, and you have an idea that we, as a body, feel responsible for that liability that's there proportionally. Is it fair to say that you folks believe that Mr. Tornquist can at least negotiate or work with them in good faith? Because nothing, it's gonna come back to this body. If it's ratified, it still comes back to this body, and it goes back to all those bodies. And, we could even have another workshop if needed, but that at least gives you a foundation to go in. You know where members are generally at. Is that fair?
So basically, we agree that post-closure funds should be pulled in the calculation. We are open to the payout occurring over X number of years. We may be open to a clause that a withdrawing community can't withdraw for a stipulated time period. We're open to that discussion, and we're open to contingency being placed on the current value of the withdrawal to cover future risk. So
I would encourage flexibility on the X number of years, though, because I can imagine arguments that would significantly impact smaller communities and create exactly the cascade you're talking about in another landfill, saying, let's start being competitive here. Next thing you know,
and
they're bold. So I would.
And a creative idea I heard, Bill, I guess for the committee might be that based on the size of the community and the financial impact of the landfill, we might have a table where if the impact is this number of dollars, we'll just pay them out.
And
If it's this big, maybe it's a payout over 5 years. If it's this big, maybe it's a payout over 10 years.
kind of what the thought process was. If you're paying for a community of 64 people to leave, there's no sense in spreading it out over 10 years.
Is there anything that I haven't mentioned that I should have, or anything that I didn't represent maybe as clearly as I should have?
Mr. Walker? No, I think it's been very helpful what you've been talking about, and there are some
creative ideas that you come up with that I think we can start talking about as a committee. The graduation of the payout, I think, has a lot of merit to it. And that the whole objective of spreading the payout out was to ensure the viability of the landfill. If Popejoy pulls out, what its entitlement would be, if it were paid 100% the first year, probably would not prejudice the viability of the landfill. If it was Clear Lake or Mason City or Sarasota County, landfill could collapse.
No one wants to do that.
And I do want to comment on your timeline, Scott. That's exactly what we're looking at. The November meeting, that was, all of the board members were asked to bring back discussion, like we picked up today, from their cities, to be able to continue committee meeting into next year. We may not be looking at recommendations until January or March meeting to come back. And I think the ultimate goal of doing it this way is we've got 29 entities that need to agree on the process that we present to 29 entities. So since we have to go to everyone and maybe we've got two polar ends saying, I just can't agree to the other side, then we may be stopping at that point, saying we give it our best shot, if that makes sense to you guys.
Should we also take away from this that there is not support for a concept that for a measure to pass, there would have to be both majority of the weighted votes plus majority of the members?
Can you ask that again?
Yeah.
The current quorum requirement is that there be a majority of weighted votes represented at the meeting and a majority of the members. One of the alternatives proposed here is that that same measurement be used to determine whether a measure would pass. In other words, you have to get a majority of the weighted votes plus a majority of the members.
Yeah, 15 cities need to vote in favor. You have 29, 15 have to vote in favor of it, no matter what the total of the votes would be. So you have to have affirmative in both cases.
But Mr. Loker, I think that was presented in the context of the initial one having a potential sit-out, or whatever we want to call it. But if that quorum wasn't reached in the next, it was the proposal, or thought, pre-thought, the next one, you know, quorum or no quorum, majority of the, no, it can't be votes present, because then you could have a minority do whatever they wanted to. You could set that up anytime you
Right
wanted
now,
to.
it's majority of votes present, provided we have a quorum.
So that's a responsibility on members.
Yeah, which is a good thing.
Interesting.
You asked that question in a way differently than I had considered it. If I understood your question, was it to suggest that a future vote would require both a majority of the weighted votes and a majority of the individual board members?
Is there support for the committee to?
I have a hard time getting excited about that personally, because that basically negates our weighted vote, potentially.
Well, I don't want to argue the proposition, but I think that there would be some protection for the larger community still, at least in the sense of a veto power.
But a veto power doesn't necessarily move something progressive forward either.
That is true.
Yeah, I think what we have 5 or 6 communities, not even that, voted in favor of CZAC. Out of 4-3. So, I mean, we'd have one more that would have put it over the edge, it would have only been 4. So we would have not even come close to being able to match what
Yeah.
you're saying.
And what
To
your
me, that
sit-out
totally
would have
negates the population of Mason City.
Can I make a statement?
Yeah.
I'm just making a statement. If you're a Popejoy with the same exact conversation though, to go into a meeting and say, you know, it passed by 4 votes, or it didn't pass by 4 votes, is one of the other things that they're looking at. This is why
Yeah.
the committee members brought this to the attention.
Yeah.
But
And the problem.
look at the amount of money that the people of Popejoy are putting into the operation versus the amount of money the people of Mason City are putting into the operation.
The corporation who owns the most shares gets the most votes to make a decision which way the company goes.
I think we should have a I would agree that we should have a majority number of the members present to be able to vote. And then once we vote, it should be weighted, as it is now. But I also am concerned about that stopgap we talked about, to where, because that's the way it's set up, if a bunch of communities just didn't show up, I think we need a stopgap to protect against that.
Otherwise you miss out on a business opportunity or not,
Potentially, yeah. It could be 3 or 4 months before a community would show up for a meeting.
So you're concerned about the existing quorum requirement to the extent that it involves a majority of the members?
I don't think he's
No,
saying that
no.
he has a problem with the quorum requirement. I think what he's doing is making a distinction between if there is something that comes up and a number of the members, majority, don't show up for the meeting to stop the meeting, that there should be a provision in there that suggests within a certain period of time, that measure may come before, and that the majority quorum would be applicable as opposed to the majority quorum of the actual towns. In other words, the weighted would now be trump the actual towns,
So that would be a change in our current structure in terms of determining a quorum.
which would prevent, a sit-out or something like that, which is not the measure, if I'm hearing you correctly.
I think so. Do you guys agree with that?
Well, also devil's advocate to an extent. Because then I'm looking at it from a small town, then they're saying, okay, we agree with that, but what if we set out a vote because, let's say the 15 members, which I'm not a big fan of it, we need a quorum of, or a majority of the voting members to be, we got 2 huge veto powers here, but what if we, didn't show up to vote? And the next
We'd be at a
time,
big disadvantage if we didn't show up.
what's that?
We'd be at an enormous disadvantage if
Well,
we didn't show up.
I agree. Well, I'm just saying, we're just playing roles here. What if then, so we sit out, so there's not a quorum of votes possibly, us and Cerro Gordo. So the next vote then, it goes to, it's not weighted, it's by how many people show up. So it has to go both ways, I would suggest, I would think. If they're trying to stay out of there by, so many towns staying out, well, from the other end, we stay out because of, it sounds like.
It works that way by default now, because
That is
all
the way it
weighted
works.
votes are based on the number of votes that are represented at a particular meeting. So if there's only
Well, they're not
34
there.
weighted votes present in a meeting, it'd be a majority of 34. It'd
Okay.
be
So
18.
it's not majority of total votes.
No, it's a majority of the
Present
weighted votes that are
Okay.
It's a
present.
disadvantage for a larger community not to be at.
Yeah.
You should be there.
Which
There.
then
You
also
can't be
goes back to
involved.
then, why it'd be better to have 3 or 4 members
Sure.
there in case if you actually can't be there, or whoever's there, to split our votes up. Oh, all right.
Quick comment?
Are you from the landfill or on the board?
No, sir.
No. Anybody else?
We good?
Jim? Mr. Wilson? Mr. Rowland? You feel comfortable, Mr. Tornquist?
I think so.
with the discussion?
I appreciate you guys coming.
Very much so.
You can help me when we get into the next discussions at the meetings, we can help carry the load together, and it won't be me being a bad guy.
When is the next landfill?
November 15th is the board meeting.
Well, thank you guys for coming. You guys are doing a good job. We appreciate the discussion. Mr. Tornquist, thank you.
Thanks.
You're doing a
Thanks for
very
having
good
us.
job as well. All right, folks. Well, let's move on to number 2.